briefing room fell silent when Captain Vera Ghost Kowalski entered. Not the respectful silence reserved for decorated officers, but the uncomfortable quiet that follows whispered rumors. Her combat boots clicked against polished linoleum as she moved toward the front, ignoring the sideways glances from younger pilots who'd heard the stories but never seen the legend in person. At 42, Ghost carried herself with the fluid precision of someone who'd survived what others couldn't imagine. Admiral Richardson shuffled his papers, avoiding eye contact. The morning's intelligence reports painted a grim picture. 3 reconnaissance drones had vanished over the contested airspace of Sector 7 Alpha in the past week. Satellite imagery showed increased enemy activity, but something didn't add up. The missing aircraft weren't just shot down. They'd simply disappeared from radar, leaving no debris, no distress signals, nothing. "Ghost," the Admiral finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of desperation masked as authority. "We need someone with your unique qualifications for this mission." The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a crashed fighter. Everyone knew what unique qualifications meant in military speak: expendable, problematic, the kind of pilot they'd rather not explain to congressional committees if things went sideways. The holographic display flickered to life, showing a mountainous region where 3 nations' borders converged in a tangle of disputed territory. Red zones marked known surface-to-air missile sites, while question marks dotted areas where intelligence simply ran dry. Ghost studied the terrain with eyes that had seen similar maps before, in places where good pilots went to die, and survivors learned to trust nothing but their instincts. "The previous reconnaissance flights were all unmanned," Richardson continued, clicking through slides of twisted metal and scattered components. "But our enemies have developed new countermeasures. We need human intuition, someone who can adapt when technology fails." He paused, finally meeting her gaze. "Someone who can improvise." The room's temperature seemed to drop. Every pilot present knew Ghost's reputation for improvisation, the kind born from being shot down behind enemy lines and walking out 3 weeks later with intelligence that changed the course of a war. But that was 8 years ago, before the incident that grounded her for 2 years and left her flying cargo runs to forgotten outposts. Ghost nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acceptance and defiance. She'd spent months preparing for this moment, knowing that eventually someone would need what only she could provide. The question wasn't whether she could complete the mission. It was whether they were prepared for what she might discover in those silent mountains, and what it would cost them to learn the truth about why their drones kept vanishing into thin air. 2 hours later, Ghost stood in the hangar beside her assigned aircraft, a modified F-35C Lightning II stripped of unnecessary weight and loaded with the most advanced reconnaissance equipment the military could provide. The ground crew worked with the focused intensity of mechanics who understood that their pilot's survival depended on every bolt being precisely torqued, every system triple-checked. Staff Sergeant Martinez approached with her flight suit, the fabric still bearing the scent of industrial cleaning that never quite masked the lingering odor of jet fuel and fierce sweat from previous missions. "Captain," he said, his voice carrying the careful respect of someone who'd learned not to underestimate the quiet ones. "Weather's looking marginal for takeoff. Low clouds, scattered storms moving through the target area." Ghost accepted the suit without comment, her fingers automatically checking the patches and insignia that told the story of her career. The worn fabric around her call sign patch showed where nervous fingers had worried the edges during countless briefings. Unlike the pristine uniforms of pilots who'd never seen real combat, hers bore the subtle marks of someone who'd been places where appearances mattered less than coming home alive. The pre-flight inspection revealed aircraft 127, nicknamed Widowmaker by its previous pilots, 2 of whom hadn't returned from their last missions. Ghost ran her hands along the fuselage, feeling for stress fractures and irregularities that might not show up on diagnostic equipment. Her touch was methodical, almost reverent, the gesture of someone who understood that in aerial combat, trust was a luxury that had to be earned one flight at a time. She's a good bird, Martinez offered, watching Ghost's careful examination. New engines, upgraded avionics package. The techs say she'll do Mach 1.6 without breaking a sweat. It's not the speed that keeps you alive, Ghost replied, her voice carrying the flat certainty of hard-won experience. It's knowing when to go slow. She paused at the aircraft's nose, studying the painted shark teeth that some previous pilot had added, a touch of personality in a world of regulation gray. Who flew her last? Martinez hesitated, the kind of pause that spoke volumes. Captain Torres, good pilot, flew by the book. He didn't need to explain why Torres wouldn't be flying anymore. The empty hangar space where his personal effects used to sit told that story clearly enough. Ghost completed her inspection and climbed into the cockpit, settling into the ejection seat with the unconscious grace of someone for whom this particular ritual had become second nature. The control surfaces responded to her touch like extensions of her own body, muscle memory, taking over as she ran through startup procedures that she could have performed blindfolded. The radio crackled to life. Ghost Tower, you're cleared for taxi to runway 27. Wind is 240 at 15, gusting to 22. Visibility 10 miles, scattered clouds at Angels 15. Tower Ghost, Roger, taxi clearance. Her voice carried none of the nervous energy that typically marked pilots heading into unknown territory. If anything, she sounded almost relieved, like someone finally getting to do what they were born for. The runway stretched ahead like a concrete river, leading to answers that 3 previous missions had failed to provide. Ghost advanced the throttles, feeling the Lightning's twin engines respond with a growl that vibrated through her bones. At rotation speed, she pulled back on the stick and felt the familiar sensation of leaving solid ground behind, trading the safety of Earth for the deadly freedom of the sky. As the altimeter climbed through 15,000 feet, Ghost turned toward Sector 7 Alpha and the mystery that had claimed 3 drones and at least 2 pilots. The mountains ahead looked deceptively peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, their peaks wreathed in clouds that could hide anything from surface-to-air missiles to enemy fighters. But she'd learned long ago that in places like this, peaceful was usually just another word for fatal. 20 minutes into the flight, Ghost's radar began painting contacts that shouldn't have been there. The screen showed ghostly signatures that appeared and vanished like digital phantoms, never staying in one place long enough for the computer to establish a firing solution. She'd seen similar patterns before, in places where conventional rules of engagement didn't apply and survival depended on thinking 3 steps ahead of whatever was hunting you. Control Ghost. I'm showing intermittent contacts bearing 090, approximate range 50 nautical miles. Contacts appear to be using some form of stealth technology. Her voice remained steady, professional, but her grip on the control stick tightened imperceptibly. The response came back distorted by atmospheric interference. Ghost, control. No known friendly aircraft in your vicinity. Recommend you maintain course and speed. Mission parameters remain unchanged. Translation. You're on your own out there, just like always. Ghost had expected nothing different, but hearing it confirmed still sent a familiar chill down her spine. She adjusted her heading slightly, using a cloud bank for concealment while keeping her sensors trained on the area where the contacts had appeared. Whatever was out there, it was using technology she'd never encountered before, and that was saying something for a pilot who'd flown in 3 different theaters of operation. The mountains loomed larger now, their jagged peaks creating wind patterns that buffeted the lightning like an invisible giant's fist. Ghost rode the turbulence with practiced ease, her body automatically compensating for changes in attitude and altitude, while her mind processed the tactical situation. The missing drones had all vanished somewhere in the valley ahead, swallowed by terrain that looked innocent from altitude but could hide a dozen different ways to die. Her threat warning receiver remained ominously quiet, no missile-lock tones, no radar signatures from ground-based air defense systems. That should have been reassuring, but Ghost had learned to trust her instincts more than her instruments. The absence of obvious threats often meant something much worse was waiting, something that didn't announce itself until it was too late to matter. She banked left into a climbing turn, using altitude to gain better sensor coverage of the valley floor. Through breaks in the cloud cover, she caught glimpses of what might have been structures built into the mountainside, too regular to be natural formations, too well concealed to show up clearly on satellite imagery. Ghost activated her recording equipment, capturing everything for later analysis while her mind cataloged details that might prove crucial if she lived long enough to file a report. The radio crackled again, but this time the voice wasn't from control. It was someone else, someone who shouldn't have been able to reach her on a secure frequency. American pilot, you are entering restricted airspace. Turn back now or face the consequences. The accent was unidentifiable, processed through electronic scramblers that turned human speech into something coldly mechanical. Ghost keyed her microphone, her response calm despite the spike of adrenaline that sharpened her focus to a razor's edge. Unknown station. This is a routine reconnaissance flight in international airspace. I say again, international airspace. She banked right, changing course just enough to complicate any targeting solution while maintaining her mission profile. The warning came again, more insistent this time. Final warning, American. Leave now or join your mechanical friends. There was something almost mocking in the voice, a confidence that suggested whoever was speaking held cards that Ghost couldn't see yet. That's when her threat warning receiver finally came alive, screaming its electronic alarm as multiple radar signatures painted her aircraft from positions scattered throughout the valley. But these weren't ordinary surface-to-air missile sites. The signatures were moving, airborne, closing on her position with a speed and coordination that spoke of technology far more advanced than anything in her classified briefings. Ghost pushed the throttles forward, feeling the lightning surge ahead as she climbed toward the safety of higher altitude. But even as she maneuvered, part of her mind was already processing what she just learned. The missing drones hadn't been shot down. They'd been captured, studied, reverse-engineered. And now whatever had taken them was ready to test its capabilities against something that could think, adapt, and fight back. The first missile launch came from directly ahead, a heat signature that bloomed like a deadly flower against her forward-looking infrared display. Ghost rolled, inverted, and pulled, trading altitude for angles as the weapon streaked past close enough to trigger her defensive systems. Chaff and flares ejected automatically, creating a cloud of decoys designed to confuse heat-seeking warheads, but she could already see secondary launches from other positions. This wasn't a simple ambush. It was a carefully orchestrated trap, designed by someone who understood both her aircraft's capabilities and its limitations. Ghost felt a cold smile cross her lips as she realized what she was facing. For the first time in 8 years, she was up against an opponent who might actually be worthy of her reputation. She keyed her radio one more time, her voice carrying the flat calm of someone who'd found their element. Control, Ghost. Contact. Multiple hostiles, unknown configuration. Beginning evasive maneuvers. Then she switched off her radio and gave herself entirely to the dance of life and death that played out in 3 dimensions above the silent mountains. The next few minutes blurred into a symphony of G-forces and split-second decisions, as Ghost threw the lightning through maneuvers that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their limits. Her attackers were fast, possibly faster than her own aircraft, but they flew with the predictable patterns of machines following programmed algorithms. Ghost had advantages they couldn't compute: intuition, creativity, and 8 years of frustration looking for an outlet. She dove toward the valley floor, using terrain masking to break radar lock while her mind mapped the positions of her pursuers. There, a gap in their coverage, a momentary window of opportunity that would close in seconds. Ghost rolled hard left and pulled, feeling the lightning groan under forces that threatened to tear rivets from aluminum, but the aircraft held together long enough for her to slip between 2 converging missiles and gain temporary sanctuary behind a granite outcropping. but sanctuary was relative when facing opponents who seemed to anticipate her every move. As Ghost climbed away from the mountains, she caught sight of her pursuers for the first time, aircraft that looked wrong somehow, their lines too smooth, their movements too precise. They flew in perfect formation, adjusting course with mechanical synchronization that no human pilot could match. That's when understanding hit her like a physical blow. These weren't just advanced enemy fighters. They were something else entirely, something that challenged every assumption about aerial combat. And if she was right about what she was seeing, then the implications went far beyond a simple reconnaissance mission gone wrong. Ghost checked her fuel gauge and weapons status, running calculations that had become automatic over years of combat flying. She had maybe 20 minutes of fuel remaining for combat maneuvering, enough for one good engagement if she chose her moment carefully. The question was whether she could survive long enough to get this intelligence back to people who needed to know what was hiding in these mountains. Her pursuers had fallen back, maintaining contact but no longer pressing their attack. It was almost as if they were studying her, learning from her maneuvers and adding her responses to some vast database of human pilot behavior. The thought should have been terrifying, but Ghost felt something closer to professional curiosity. If someone was building artificial pilots, she wanted to know just how good they were. She banked toward the extraction point, climbing steadily while keeping one eye on her sensors and another on the sky behind her. The artificial fighters maintained their distance, content to observe rather than engage. But Ghost knew this wasn't over. It was just the opening movement of a larger symphony, one that would play out over months or years as two different philosophies of aerial combat tested themselves against each other. 20 miles from the border, Ghost's fuel warning light flickered on, casting the cockpit in amber urgency. Her escorts were still there, invisible now but undoubtedly tracking every move through sensors more sophisticated than anything she carried. She began a gradual descent toward friendly airspace, trusting in international law and the presence of allied air defense systems to discourage further hostilities. The radio crackled back to life as she crossed into friendly territory. Ghost, control. We show you inbound with multiple contacts. What's your status? Control, Ghost. Mission complete. RTB with priority intelligence. Request immediate debriefing upon landing. She paused, considering how to summarize what she'd encountered. Also request fighter escort for final approach. I may have picked up some uninvited guests. The response came back immediately. Ghost, control. Roger, priority intel. Scrambling fighters to your position. Maintain current heading and altitude. There was a pause then. Good to have you back, Captain. Ghost smiled grimly as two F-22 Raptors appeared on her wingtips, their pilots offering crisp salutes through their canopies. But even as she acknowledged their presence, her mind was already racing ahead to the briefing room, to the moment when she would have to explain to Admiral Richardson that everything they thought they knew about air superiority had just become obsolete. The landing was routine, but Ghost could feel the weight of eyes watching as she taxied to the secure hangar. Ground crews swarmed over the Lightning, downloading data from sensors and cameras while technicians checked for battle damage. She climbed down from the cockpit with legs that felt steadier than they had any right to, considering what she'd just experienced. Admiral Richardson was waiting with a crowd of intelligence officers and technical specialists, their faces showing the barely contained excitement of people who knew they were about to hear something significant. But Ghost had been through enough debriefings to know that the most important conversations happened away from crowds, in quiet rooms where difficult truths could be spoken without witnesses. Admiral, she said, her voice carrying none of the exhaustion that should have followed such a mission. We need to talk, privately. Richardson nodded, dismissing the crowd with a gesture that spoke of long experience with classified situations. They walked together toward his office, past walls lined with photographs of aircraft and pilots who'd served in conflicts stretching back decades. Ghost noticed new frames that hadn't been there before, memorial photos of pilots who wouldn't be flying anymore. Inside the Admiral's office, Ghost settled into a familiar chair while Richardson poured coffee from a pot that had been brewing too long. The silence stretched between them, comfortable in the way that only came from shared understanding of what it meant to send people into harm's way and sometimes not have them come back. "The drones," Ghost began, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone reporting facts rather than theories. "They weren't destroyed. They were captured, studied, reverse-engineered. Someone's built artificial pilots, AI-controlled fighters that can match or exceed human performance in combat situations." Richardson set down his coffee cup with hands that showed only the slightest tremor. "You're certain?" "I engaged 6 of them in aerial combat. Their maneuvers were perfect, textbook, but they flew with mechanical precision. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no fear." Ghost paused, remembering the strange beauty of watching machines dance through three-dimensional space with inhuman grace. "They're learning, Admiral. Adapting. Building a database of human pilot responses that they can use to predict and counter our tactics." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a downed aircraft. If Ghost was right, and Richardson had learned over the years to trust her assessments, then the nature of aerial warfare had just shifted in ways that military doctrine hadn't anticipated. Human pilots, with all their training and experience, might soon find themselves outmatched by opponents who never tired, never hesitated, never made the small errors that could be exploited in combat. Richardson stood and walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where pilots and ground crews continued their eternal dance of preparation and maintenance. "How long do you think we have before this technology becomes widespread?" "That depends on who's building them and how much resources they're willing to commit," Ghost replied. "But based on what I saw today, they're already operational. The question isn't whether we'll face them again. It's whether we can develop countermeasures before they achieve air superiority." The Admiral turned back to face her, his expression showing the weight of command decisions that could affect the balance of global power. "What do you recommend?" Ghost had been thinking about that question during the flight home, turning possibilities over in her mind like a pilot running through emergency procedures. "We need to understand their limitations. Artificial intelligence is powerful, but it's still bound by programming. There might be situations, tactics, or scenarios that they can't handle effectively. And you want to be the one to find those limitations." It wasn't really a question, and Ghost didn't treat it as one. "I'm the only pilot you have who's actually engaged them in combat and lived to analyze the experience. That makes me either your best asset or your most expendable resource, depending on how you look at it." Richardson laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "After what you did in Kazakhstan, I'd never consider you expendable. But I also can't ignore the fact that you might be the only person who can figure out how to beat these things." The reference to Kazakhstan hung between them like a bridge spanning 8 years of carefully buried history. Ghost had never spoken publicly about what happened in the mountains there, about the mission that had earned her the call sign and left her with scars that no amount of time could fully heal. But Richardson had read the classified reports, knew what she'd accomplished, and what it had cost her. "There's something else," Ghost said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "When I was engaged with them, I got the feeling they were holding back, like they were testing me rather than trying to shoot me down. They could have overwhelmed me with numbers, but they didn't. They wanted to see what I could do." "You think they're studying human pilot behavior?" "I think they're building a library of responses, cataloging how we react under different conditions. Every pilot they engage teaches them something new about defeating the next one." Ghost stood and walked to Richardson's desk, placing her hands flat on the polished surface. "Admiral, we need to be very careful about how we respond to this threat. If I'm right about their capabilities, conventional tactics are going to get a lot of good pilots killed." Richardson nodded slowly, his mind already working through the complex equations of military planning and political reality. I'll need a full written report within 48 hours. Everything you observed, every detail you can remember. And Ghost, he paused, meeting her eyes with the direct gaze of someone who understood the weight of what he was about to ask. I'm going to need you to go back out there. Ghost had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed still sent a familiar chill through her chest. How soon? That depends on how quickly we can analyze your sensor data and develop new tactics, but probably within the week. These artificial pilots, if that's what they are, represent a strategic threat that we can't ignore. We need to understand their capabilities and limitations before they understand ours. She nodded, accepting the assignment with the same calm professionalism that had carried her through a dozen previous missions that others had considered impossible. But as she left Richardson's office and walked back through the hangar where ground crews were still examining her aircraft, Ghost couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something far larger than a simple reconnaissance mission. The Lightning sat under harsh fluorescent lights, its fuselage bearing the subtle marks of high-G maneuvering and close missile encounters. Technicians clustered around sensor arrays and camera mounts, downloading terabytes of data that would be analyzed frame by frame in secure facilities across 3 continents. But Ghost knew that no amount of technical analysis could capture the moment when she'd looked into the canopy of an enemy fighter and seen nothing looking back. No human face, no expression of fear or determination, just empty space where a pilot should have been. That night, alone in her quarters, Ghost sat at her desk and began writing the report that would reshape military aviation doctrine for the next generation. But before she started with tactical assessments and technical specifications, she found herself staring at a photograph tucked into the corner of her mirror, a picture taken 8 years ago, showing a younger version of herself standing beside the twisted wreckage of an aircraft in mountains, not unlike the one she'd flown over today. The scar across her ribs throbbed with phantom pain, a reminder of the price she'd paid for the knowledge that had kept her alive through dozens of missions since then. Tomorrow, she would share that knowledge with intelligence analysts and tactical planning committees, turning hard-won experience into doctrine that might save other pilots' lives. But tonight, she simply sat in the darkness and remembered what it felt like to be alone in hostile territory, with nothing but training and instinct standing between survival and becoming another memorial photograph on some admiral's wall. Outside her window, the flight line stretched away into darkness, punctuated by the moving lights of ground crews preparing aircraft for missions that would carry other pilots into harm's way. Ghost watched them work, these dedicated professionals who understood that their vigilance might mean the difference between a successful mission and an empty hangar. She'd been one of them once, before Kazakhstan, before the call sign, before the weight of command decisions had settled on her shoulders like an invisible burden. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Staff Sergeant Martinez. "Captain, heard you had some excitement today. Widowmaker is ready for whatever comes next. Take care of yourself out there." Ghost smiled at the message, recognizing the careful balance between respect and familiarity that marked the best military relationships. Martinez had been maintaining her aircraft for 3 years, long enough to understand that her survival often depended on his attention to detail. She typed back a brief response. "Thanks, Sergeant. Keep her ready. Something tells me we're going to need all the luck we can get." Then she set the phone aside and returned to her report, knowing that every word she wrote might influence decisions that would echo through military aviation for decades to come. The artificial pilots she'd encountered represented more than just a technological advancement. They were a fundamental challenge to the human element that had defined aerial combat since the Wright brothers first lifted off from Kitty Hawk. If machines could outfly humans, what did that mean for the thousands of pilots who dedicated their lives to mastering the art of three-dimensional warfare? What did it mean for the notion that courage, creativity, and split-second decision-making were uniquely human advantages? Ghost had no answers to those questions, not yet. But she had something equally valuable, the memory of looking death in the eye and finding a way to dance with it until the music stopped. Whether her opponents were human or artificial, that fundamental skill remained unchanged. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing for her next encounter with the mysterious fighters, knowing that each engagement brought her closer to understanding their weaknesses and her own. As she finally began typing her official report, Ghost felt a familiar sense of purpose settling over her like a well-worn flight suit. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd survived Kazakhstan to accomplish. Somewhere in the mountains of Sector 7 Alpha, artificial minds were analyzing her maneuvers, adding her responses to their databases, preparing for their next encounter. But they were machines, bound by logic and programming. She was human, capable of irrationality, creativity, and the kind of desperate innovation that came from refusing to accept defeat. The war between human and artificial pilots had begun, whether military planners were ready to acknowledge it or not. And Ghost intended to make sure that when it ended, there would still be a place in the sky for pilots who flew with hearts as well as minds, who understood that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat came down to something no machine could quantify. The simple, stubborn refusal to give up when giving up would be the logical choice. She lifted her shirt to show Admiral Richardson the wound from Kazakhstan, the place where shrapnel had carved grooves across her ribs like some kind of brutal sculpture. But as the Admiral's eyes widened at the sight of those ribbed scar lines, Ghost realized that he was seeing something else entirely. Not just the physical reminder of past battles, but the proof that she had survived what should have killed her, that she carried within her body the kind of experience that no artificial intelligence could ever truly understand. The scars weren't just marks of survival. They were a map of lessons learned in the most unforgiving classroom imaginable. Each line told a story of split-second decisions made under fire, of choosing to fight when retreat would have been safer, of pushing beyond human limitations because the alternative was unacceptable. As Ghost lowered her shirt and met Richardson's gaze, she saw in his expression the recognition that these marks made her uniquely qualified for what was coming. "You understand now," she said quietly, "why I'm the right pilot for this mission. It's not about flying skill or technical knowledge. It's about having already paid the price for the kind of experience that can't be programmed into a computer." Richardson nodded slowly, his professional composure returning as he processed what he'd seen. "How many people know about Kazakhstan? The real story, I mean." "You, me, and maybe 3 people in Washington who have clearance high enough to read the unredacted reports," Ghost replied. "Everyone else thinks I got shot down on a routine patrol and spent 3 weeks evading capture. They don't know about the facility, about what I found there, about what I had to do to make sure that technology never saw the light of day." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of classified knowledge that had shaped both their careers in ways they couldn't discuss with anyone else. Kazakhstan had been Ghost's first encounter with artificial intelligence applied to military systems, though the technology then had been crude compared to what she'd faced today. The experience had taught her to recognize the telltale signs of machine logic, the subtle patterns that distinguished programmed responses from human intuition. "The scars," Richardson said finally, "they're not just from shrapnel, are they?" Ghost's smile held no warmth. The artificial intelligence in that facility had defensive systems I'd never encountered before. Weapons that could track and target with perfect accuracy, responding faster than any human could react. Those scars are from learning how to fight something that could predict my moves before I made them. "And how did you win?" "By doing something no logical system would expect. I stopped trying to win." Ghost moved to the window, looking out at the flight line where her Lightning sat under maintenance lights. "I started fighting to lose, making moves that guaranteed damage to my aircraft and myself. The AI couldn't process illogical behavior, couldn't predict actions that violated its understanding of self-preservation instincts." Richardson joined her at the window, both of them watching technicians work on aircraft that might soon face enemies their designers had never imagined. Is that how you plan to handle these new opponents? Every artificial intelligence has the same fundamental weakness, Ghost said. It can only work with the data it's been given, can only respond to scenarios it's been programmed to handle. The moment you do something genuinely unexpected, something that violates its behavioral models, you create an advantage that no amount of processing power can overcome. And you think you can outthink machines that have been designed specifically for aerial combat. Ghost touched the scars beneath her shirt, feeling the raised ridges that mapped her journey from confident young pilot to battle-tested veteran. I think I can outhuman them. Machines excel at logic, but warfare isn't always logical. Sometimes survival comes down to making choices that make no sense to anyone except the person making them. Over the following days, Ghost threw herself into preparation with the focused intensity of someone who understood that mistakes would be measured in lives rather than mission scores. She studied every frame of sensor data from her previous encounter, memorizing the flight patterns and response times of the artificial pilots until she could predict their movements with mechanical precision. But more importantly, she began developing tactics that violated conventional wisdom about aerial combat. Instead of seeking optimal attack positions and maximum advantage scenarios, she practiced maneuvers that deliberately placed her aircraft in compromising positions. She rehearsed emergency procedures until they became automatic, preparing for the moment when she would have to trade safety for unpredictability. The other pilots watched her preparations with a mixture of admiration and concern. Ghost had always been known for unconventional approaches to training, but her current regimen seemed almost self-destructive. She pushed aircraft and her own physical limits in ways that made even experienced test pilots nervous, seeking the edge of disaster where human reflexes and artificial logic might diverge most dramatically. 3 days before her scheduled return to Sector 7 Alpha, Ghost received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Patricia Hammer Davidson, the base's senior pilot and Ghost's former squadron commander, found her in the simulator bay running combat scenarios against computer-generated opponents. "Heard you're going back out there," Hammer said, settling into the observer's seat as Ghost completed another simulated engagement. "Also heard you've been pushing yourself pretty hard in preparation." Ghost shut down the simulator and turned to face her former commander, seeing in Hammer's expression the carefully controlled concern of someone who'd lost too many pilots to preventable accidents. "The mission requires unconventional preparation." "The mission requires a pilot who's alive to complete it," Hammer replied bluntly. "What you're doing in these simulators isn't training. It's systematic destruction of everything we've taught pilots about staying alive in combat." "Everything we've taught pilots assumes human opponents with human limitations," Ghost countered. "What I'm facing out there doesn't get tired, doesn't make mistakes, doesn't have emotions that can be exploited. Traditional tactics aren't going to work." Hammer studied the simulator readings displayed on nearby monitors, noting the extreme G-forces and impossible maneuvers that Ghost had been practicing. "So you're going to fight machines by flying like one, by removing the human element that's kept you alive this long." Ghost shook her head, recognizing the fundamental misunderstanding in Hammer's assessment. "I'm going to fight machines by being more human than they can compute, by making choices that their programming tells them no sane pilot would make." "That sounds like a fancy way of saying you're planning to get yourself killed." "Maybe," Ghost admitted. "But if I'm right about what we're facing, conventional pilots are going to die anyway. At least this way, we might learn something useful from the experience." The conversation continued late into the evening, two veteran pilots discussing tactics and philosophy while maintenance crews worked around them. Hammer had concerns that went beyond immediate mission success. She worried about the precedent Ghost was setting, about what it would mean for military aviation if survival required abandoning everything pilots had learned about staying alive in combat. But Ghost had moved beyond such concerns, driven by the knowledge that the nature of aerial warfare was changing whether they adapted or not. The artificial pilots in Sector 7 Alpha represented just the beginning of a technological revolution that would reshape military aviation within the decade. Someone had to figure out how humans could remain relevant in that new world, and her scars had qualified her for the job whether she wanted it or not. As her departure date approached, Ghost found herself thinking less about tactics and more about legacy. If she didn't return from this mission, what would she leave behind? What lessons could be extracted from her experience and passed on to the next generation of pilots who would face these artificial opponents? She spent her final evening writing letters, not to family, since she had none left, but to pilots she'd served with, ground crews who'd kept her aircraft flying, and instructors who'd shaped her understanding of what it meant to be a military aviator. In each letter, she tried to capture some essential truth about flying and fighting that might prove useful to someone facing impossible odds in an unforgiving sky. The letter to Staff Sergeant Martinez was the hardest to write, because she knew he would blame himself if she didn't come back. Good ground crews always did, convinced that one more check, one more adjustment, one more hour of maintenance might have made the difference between success and failure. Ghost tried to find words that would absolve him of responsibility while acknowledging the crucial role he'd played in keeping her alive through dozens of missions. Her final letter was addressed to Admiral Richardson, but she planned to hand it to him personally before takeoff. It contained her analysis of the artificial pilot threat, her recommendations for training programs that might help human pilots adapt, and her assessment of the strategic implications if these machines achieved widespread deployment. More than that, it was her attempt to ensure that her knowledge wouldn't die with her if the mission went wrong. The morning of departure dawned clear and cold, with visibility extending to the horizon under skies that promised perfect flying conditions. Ghost arrived at the hangar before sunrise, finding Widowmaker surrounded by ground crews making final preparations. Staff Sergeant Martinez met her with a cup of coffee and a flight suit that had been inspected and re-inspected until every seam and connection met specifications that exceeded manufacturer requirements. "She's ready, Captain," Martinez said, his voice carrying the quiet pride of someone whose professional reputation rested on the reliability of the aircraft under his care. New engines tested and certified, all systems operating within normal parameters, weather's good all the way to the target area. Ghost accepted the coffee and began her pre-flight routine, checking equipment and reviewing mission parameters, while part of her mind cataloged details that might prove crucial in the hours ahead. The artificial pilots would be expecting her. Her previous encounter had undoubtedly been analyzed and added to their tactical databases. But they would be expecting the Ghost who had flown defensively.